Hello, and thank you so much for joining me today. I've got a long video for you today, so without further ado, I think we're going to jump straight into drafting and sewing a 50s style dress for Smartdoll. Okay, so I took some inspiration off of Pinterest and essentially simplified a cute 50s dress that I thought I wanted to try to draft. That is what this is. And it is, most of the drafting is going to of course be this bodice is going to be the trickiest part. This I think I will just do as like a half circle skirt, maybe even a 3/4 circle skirt to give it some fullness at the bottom. And then this kind of thing would be worn with a belt, which I don't have a belt. I'm sure I could figure something out, but we'll tackle that when we tackle that. Because of the design, I suspect for humans, designs like this would actually button. Like you could actually unbutton it, and then it usually would have like a zipper in the side seam so that you can actually wiggle out of it, because of course this is going to be too tight, because none of this outfit is going to have any stretch to it. It's all going to be made out of woven material. Because this is going to be for a doll, I am going to forego making proper buttonholes and instead move the entire closure to the back, where we'll either snap or zipper or both, but we'll figure that out later. Doesn't really matter right now. Right now, the changes that I need to make to my sloper are going to involve collar is going to be shaped differently. This is going to need to extend out on both sides so that there is some overlap, because even though we're not going to make proper buttons, we need it to look like there are buttons. And then this dart gets to stay the same. This dart is going to need to be moved up into here to create these 3 pleats on both sides. 3 might be a little excessive for a doll. We're gonna see how that goes. They might turn into gathers or something else. I don't know yet. Other thing is that this seam line, like my shoulder seam is up here, so that needs to drop a little bit to become, down here. So that would involve taking some of this and putting it onto the back so that the back will come around to the front and attach and be good. So if I want this overlap to be 1/4 of an inch wide, I need to add 1/8 of an inch from the center for the top one, and then 1/8 of an inch on the bottom one. So on my actual pattern piece, I only need to add 1/8 of an inch. And to do that, first I'm going to draw my seam allowance, because this does not have seam allowance along the front. So along this straight line, I'm lining up my ruler so that this is 1/4 of an inch, because that's my normal seam allowance. And then I'm going to draw in that 1/8 of an inch that we're going to add for overlap. And now we're going to line this up. And I always just trace the whole thing as is before I've made changes. Oops. And of course, now that the camera is on, I am incapable of doing this in a graceful manner. But that's just how it is. Okay, so in our picture, we know that instead of coming up around near the top of the neck like it does here, we actually want this to V down. So proportionally, I think coming down to about here, because we still want it to be fairly modest, is going to be acceptable. And then at this point, because this is the bit that we added for overlap, but at this point it's just seam allowance. So I'm actually going to just take that straight to the edge. Now on my pattern, this guy, I do have seam allowance. So by taking it from here, I am including seam allowance. So my actual final stitch line is going to be down here. So it's not quite as modest as it looks. I do know that I need to move this down. I'm just gonna guess at it. I think 1/4 of an inch will be plenty. So if I move that down 1/4 of an inch, that should be enough of those changes. To change this dart placement, I actually need to cut this piece out and chop it up.
I recommend cutting off the lines you've drawn when you traced, because it adds just the tiniest bit to your pattern every time you trace it, and if you cut on the inside of that line you can avoid that.
Now, and even scraps this little I set aside and I keep around because I will eventually need them. But now I want to move this extra material up to here, basically. So my apex is where these darts point to. And draw a line, and then I draw another line going up into the area that I want to add the extra into. Cut straight to that line. I don't cut it completely off. I leave just the tiniest bit so that it can dangle. And the reason I do that is because it makes this part easier. So we've got this guy, and this is just free floating. Well, we can take this all the way down touch. I want these edges to touch, and you'll see that's added a whole lot up here. So this is kind of jagged, and I just smooth that out by sort of taking the difference. This is also jagged, and it's actually not supposed to be, so whoops. This guy we're keeping as is. And I actually want to continue to mark my center front, just because that's good info to have. Now, because these are either going to be gathered or turned into pleats, I don't actually need to turn it into a dart. But if I wanted this to be just a big old dart, I would actually move up about the same distance that this guy is in the very center, and then I would draw my lines from there to there.
However, I do not need a dart, so I erase that, and then this part was hard to describe, and I did a poor job of it in the moment, so I'm coming at you through voiceover to show how we're gonna even out those jagged edges by essentially finding the difference between them. So I marked it, and I used my clear ruler to see that, okay, that is about 1/4 inch between both of those marks. So I marked the 1/8 of an inch spot and drew my line through that. And you can see the one is higher, the one is lower. That's kind of finding the midpoint. And then I just draw a gently curving line that hits all 3 of the points that I need to hit.
So I was having a hard time figuring out how the pleats would work, and to sort of, I can be very hands-on, to sort of figure it out, I drew a bunch of 1/4 inch marks on this piece of paper, and I pulled that to match each one. And I thought, okay, that looks pretty good. I want the pleats to face in this direction so that the extra fabric, I don't know the words for this, I'm sorry, but this is how I wanted it to sit on the shoulder when this is the front side up. So stretching this out, I find I do have enough room for the 3 pleats, and that's cool. So I am going to mark the pattern piece. So this is the line that touches this line. Then we're gonna go to this line, touches this line, and then this line touches this line. So those are my pleat markings. I think I will like how that looks. Now, this is only the front piece that we've changed. The back, I didn't sketch out, and the back, I think I am going to keep similar to the sloper. You may recall that we cut that 1/4 inch off the top here because we were moving that seam as well. So we're going to add that back onto this.
At this point, I spend entirely too much time deciding how much seam allowance I'm going to include for the back closure. This is especially ironic because I don't actually end up using this information. Whoops. But then I just start tracing the piece in full again and add that extra 1/4 inch.
So to add that 1/4 inch back in, pretty easy. There it is. Now, to have done that properly, I would have actually cut the piece out of the front piece and then taped it onto the back piece. I'm not gonna do that. We're gonna see if this will work. It might not. Should be interesting. So after I cut the pieces out for the mock-up, I realized that I was being optimistic that this would make any sense and actually work because it's got to scrunch down to the correct length, not just, so like these markings don't mean anything. However, after playing with it for a little bit, it seems like they can make teensy tiny, like 1/8 inch pleats, hopefully. So we're gonna give that a go. Okay, so I think it worked for the most part, but I sort of want to do a few changes. I love that this is working, that you can now see this seam from the front, but I think it needs to go down another 1/4 inch. And then I also think that this is much too high. This can go down at least a 1/2 inch, even accounting for the seam allowance. So I am going to try and make those changes and see how that ends up looking. Got back. So on the back, we're going to add another 1/4 inch And again, I'm not doing it properly, I'm just adding it and vaguely hoping that it'll be fine. So that's the easy alteration. The hard alteration is this, because I think I'm going to, rather than pull this down, I think I'm going to pull this down and redo this piece. Simply because I'm not sure that just drawing 1/4 of an inch is actually going to be the best option. Actually, no, I'm going to do it the easy way. And we will see if it works together. This I am actually going to alter as well, because this might become a lining piece, simply because there's no point in doing complicated pleats in the lining, so I'm not gonna. So that's been shaved 1/4 inch down. Now this is going to be shaved 1/4 inch down. Actually, I might try to do this one a little bit more.
At this point, I decided to take down the collar by that 1/2 inch I had decided on earlier, and I don't know why I was still insisting on making a weird edge with the seam allowance, but I was. It makes no sense for it to be shaped like that. There was no need for that extra. I could have just made it normal, and I didn't, for whatever reason. I don't know why. And I keep staring at it. Like, there's long periods of footage that I've been cutting out while I stare at it and try to figure out why it doesn't seem right. And it's because it doesn't need to have a right angle in it. There's no point to it. Anyway, rant over. It's weird and I don't know why I'm doing it. But then I do transfer it over to the lining because that does need to match.
So one thing I do when I am testing patterns is also testing how I want to construct them. And in this case, I've got 2 front pieces. One is the lining, which has the 2 darts, and one is going to be the single dart and then the pleats. And I am just going to line the front pieces and essentially flat fill them. So I am gonna need to go over to the sewing, or the iron, and iron these pieces into position while I'm ironing my darts. And then I'm also going to go through and probably just top stitch these pleats into place over the top here. And I'm thinking it might be easier to pleat them down onto this other piece of fabric than it would be otherwise, but I'm not sure. So I'm going to do that, I'm also going to, when I iron these, normally I iron everything facing towards the back, but these ones I'm actually going to change up so that when they go together like this, they're not on top of each other, and that should alleviate some of the bulk that would otherwise accumulate in the waistband. So that's where we are for now, and I will be back. Okay, so because this edge is finished and this is not, I decided to make a quick and dirty facing on the back neck piece. So I'm just going to use this little piece of fabric, line it up, trying to match the grains, and then I'm going to stitch this and then cut out the stuff I don't need, and then cut this to be about there. It's not sophisticated, and I'm already falling out of love with this half-lined concept, but we're going to see it to the end and see how it looks. So this was attempt 1. Okay, so attempt 2, and you might have noticed this side has 3 tiny pleats and this side has 2 bigger pleats. I wanted to test out because the farther down I went, the less fabric I had to work with, and I think I like the seam here. It feels like it's more intentionally forward. The neckline is still a lot more conservative than I expected it to be. I don't know if I like that or not. Well, I think I like that. The back fits just fine. The lining fits nicely under the top. So now it's kind of a matter of deciding, do I want to stick with full lining or go with just a facing for this edge? Because this half lining, half facing, I don't think it's worth the trouble. And with thinner fabrics you can see through it, which is also not ideal. Which kind of has me leaning towards fully lined. And do I like 2 or 3 better? I think I like the 2 better. So after some thought, I've decided that rather than make this a faux button front, I'm going to turn that into the actual front, and the back will be fully lined, and the skirt will also have buttons, and I think that will be really cute. I've been wanting to do a design like that forever, so to change up my design, this will just continue down with more buttons, or I'll probably do snaps, and these 3 little pleats are going to turn into 2 pleats. But the majority of the design is going to stay the same. I think fully lining is going to make finishing the sleeves better as well. So now to get the skirt on, we're going to need the skirt to have some overlap, but I don't want the skirt to be fully lined. So I think I'll design the skirt to have this edge overlap behind the closures on both sides. For human patterns, I would try to figure out how to stick a pocket in. Oh, actually, how cute would that be? No, not digging it. So for a human pattern, I think maybe a pocket like that internally would be really freaking cute. For the doll pattern, I don't want to make this any more complicated than it already is, so I'm going to shelf that idea for a future project and probably just do this as, if I can get away with it, one piece. I think I was talking about doing a half circle, so it would be like a half circle and then whatever overlap we need added on to the ends. Now that we have a pattern that works, the lining for the back piece is literally just going to be another back piece. We're not going to change that in any way. Yeah, I guess we can do the half circle. So I have a half circle skirt pattern that I made eons ago that I am just going to use for this purpose. It already has a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I am going to add a 1/2 inch onto that when I cut, and that will be what folds over.
So now we're back into kind of familiar territory. This is the sort of thing that a lot of my videos are, which is just how I put things together. And previously I had cut a bunch of footage where I literally just boringly talked myself through this and mumbled a lot. So I figured I would cut that and then just show you what I ended up deciding would probably be a little bit more interesting. I also realized there's 10 darts in this whole project. That's a lot of darts. So I've sewn them all together off camera, and now I need to sew my shoulder seams for my lining, which is pretty straightforward, and then I move on to the shoulder seams for the main fabric, which is less straightforward. At this point, I was still kind of figuring out how I wanted to do the pleats, and so I end up playing around with it quite a lot. Unfortunately, some of that ended up off camera. I do apologize. In the end, the goal is for them to be as symmetrical as possible. And by the time I am finished with the pattern itself, I'm able to mark the ends of the pleats, and it's a lot easier when you can do that. Since I don't have any of those markings, I still haven't figured any of that out yet. It's just a lot of trial and error to get there. Folding it and holding it up like that also makes it a lot easier to see if they are as similar to each other as I want them to be. Once the shoulder seams have been sewn together, I then start pinning the front center all the way up along the collar and back down to the other front center, making sure to match those shoulder seams as I'm going. I also do the armholes as well, again making sure to match the shoulder seams. I go ahead and stitch along all 3 of those lines, and then I go in and notch the corners. I snip all of the curves, and I cut out some of that extra seam allowance because that just adds bulk that we really don't need. And then I flip things right sides out, and I find it easiest to do just one side and then the other. And it looks all poofy and silly, so you go along those seams that you just made and trimmed and push them all out to their fullest extent and iron it all flat nice. Once it's been ironed, it's looking a lot better. I did slow this clip down because this part is a little bit hard to explain with words because I'm sewing up the side seams, but I am going to sew only the lining to the lining and only the fashion fabric to the fashion fabric. And that makes a really nice seam that is completely internal, and I really like how it looks. I think it's only a method you can do when you have a sleeveless bodice, but it is a really nice one. So that is what I am showing right now, is just how I pin that down to then go sew. And you just kind of squish the rest of the bodice out of the way because you don't want to get that in your seam. So this is just to show you what it looks like once it's been pressed, and it just makes a really neat looking finish on the inside. And then I do try it on the doll just to make absolutely sure, of course. This was about when I realized that understitching the collar would be a good idea before sewing the armholes, because even with a really good iron, I was still having trouble with that little sliver of white showing down the center front, and I didn't like it. I did fix it eventually, but it is easily avoidable by just doing an understitch after you've sewn your collar. And the understitch is just where you sew your seam allowance directly to the lining, like 1 millimeter away from your original stitch line. And it's kind of a really cool and nice technique. But you can see here the rest of it fits really nicely. There's a good overlap in the front. I am really glad that I decided to stick with the front closure instead of my original idea, which was back closures, because this just looks nice. Then we jump to the skirt, and I do switch up the order of the skirt a little bit in the official instructions because I changed my mind a few times, but in this one I serged those flat edges and then I went straight ahead and serged the bottom hem and then hemmed it up as well. That is what I would recommend holding off on. Wait until it's attached to the front of to the bodice and then hem it properly, but it doesn't hurt to push it through a serger at this point because you don't want that curved edge to fray too much. In the meantime, we're now finding the center of the skirt as well as the center of the bodice. I line up the main fashion fabric of the bodice with the skirt with right sides facing, and I leave the lining to kind of hang out and do its thing. Then I use my fingers to sort of walk along that seam and line everything up evenly. The key here is that the center front piece needs to be even, so you can see me comparing both sides to make sure that they're about the same. And then I go ahead and sew that down. Now you can see it doesn't look right until you pull the skirt down and suddenly it sort of self-faces and makes a little placket in the front. And here I'm showing you different ways of possibly finishing it, and I've actually experimented with this after the fact, and I don't like any of those methods because it creates too much bulk in the waist, like right in the front on her waistband, and it looks really awkward. So the method I'm doing here is actually, in my opinion, the best method for alleviating that. And I've pinned it flat, and I'm literally just going to sew all along that seam. And this will essentially finish the waistband. I have serged the edge, and I'm just going in to be extra fancy and tying off my serging. You want to finish your serging in some way, but tying it off isn't always everybody's favorite. But I did it here for some reason. Sometimes I'll just thread it through a needle and stuff it into the seam. But either way, this edge is now not going to fray because it's been serged, and the seam allowance faces downwards, which means it's not going to bulk up the waistband right on her tummy like it would with some of those other methods. I do fold that over. It's a 3/4 of an inch folded over, and I try to keep that even, and I go and just press that into place so that it stays nice. Then I just go ahead and try it on the doll again, just to be safe. Now it was time to figure out what buttons I wanted to use, and I loved the 2 small buttons. I thought they were an excellent size, but I only had 2 of them and I needed 7. So I looked at the yellow ones, they were too pastel. I looked at the tan ones and I loved them, and then the brown ones just really stood out. I like those a lot. I also have these crimp-on, like no-sew snaps, which I really prefer to use, but ultimately the brown looks so much nicer and matched better, so I went with that. Now it was time to figure out exactly where the buttons needed to go, and this takes a lot of trial and error, and I'm basically pinning where I think they should be. And I really wanted to avoid that gap you get in the bust area, so I wanted a pin dead center there. And then I also wanted them to look even. I didn't know how many I was going to be using at this point, so I was kind of experimenting with a lot. I ended up paring it down a little bit, in part because I didn't want to sew that many and I thought it just looked nicer. I also left that gap right above the waistband specifically so that there would be room to put a belt. And when I kind of had in my head how I wanted it to go, I marked the edge where the overlap is and took it off, leaving my pins in place. So now that I had a general idea of where they needed to go, it was time to sort of true them up. And to do that, I used my ruler to figure out, exactly how far apart they are from each other, and then find a good middle ground. So now you can see I found my middle ground was 1 1/8 inches. So I changed the pins up just the tiniest bit so that they're all evenly spaced. And then I just carry that 1/8 and 1 inch down the skirt, because the skirt is really free-flowing. It's not as important where the buttons land there, just that there's a set amount of them and they're evenly spaced. So now that I know I have to put my buttons on both sides, so I line them up and I mark them. I'm using a heat erase pen again. They're really, really nice for this kind of work because you can actually see them, they're precise, and you don't have to worry so much about whether or not it'll stain. Sometimes they do. Test it with your fabric. I have had excellent luck with this one. It hasn't stained anything yet, but I don't know what I went off to do. Oh, I actually went and erased a few of my markings because they were wrong. That's right, I remember now. But this is a part where precision is extremely important, and I got sick of being stabbed, so I marked where my pens were. And now it's just a matter of sewing your snaps on. I decided to go snaps with buttons over top just because the buttons are teensy tiny and I didn't think they were going to work very well as intended. So here is a lot of footage of me sewing snaps, and for once remembering to keep it on camera. How cool is that? It's still really boring to watch though. I spend a lot of time when I'm lining my snaps up even when I'm halfway through the snap, to make sure that it is on my mark the way I want it to be. And then when I have a lot of extra thread, I will sometimes just run it through between my layers, but I only was ever able to do 2 snaps at a time. You get the idea though. I hand sew all of the snaps on, and then on the other side I hand sew the buttons right over top of where the snaps are. And there you have it. I really loved how this one turned out. I love the 50s vibe. I love the original colors I tried it out in, that sort of gold, brown, and I also really enjoyed it in the pink and white version too. So I did go ahead and polish this pattern up a little bit, and it is now for sale for download in my Etsy, which I will provide a link down below for that. And I am hoping to convert a lot of my patterns to stuff that is for sale and stuff that you can have access to. It is time consuming. So while I'm making videos, I can't be doing that, and while I'm doing that, I can't be making videos. So I've been trying to sort of balance things a little bit to get as much stuff out as quickly as possible for you guys. It's a learning curve for me. Despite having made YouTube videos for a while now, I'm still not super great at it. Recently, a bunch of costumers, people on YouTube who do a lot of costuming, made what is called CocoVid, which is like costuming college but online, because they were kind of bummed that the actual costuming college couldn't happen this year. It was a whole bunch of cool videos. A bunch of them are still going to be up, and they're really good and really fun. They were really inspiring, and they kind of lit the fire. I want to make YouTube videos better for you guys. So going forward, I've got a few plans to try and capture better footage, to try and make more of a story, make maybe some of the drier aspects a little bit more interesting. And I'm pretty pumped about it, and I hope you are too. So with that in mind, thank you so much for joining me, and like and subscribe if you want to see all the cool new things coming up later. Have a good one.